Hello, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. My name is Dr. David Bleiweiss, Chief Medical Officer for Cell Science Systems. The purpose of this webinar series is to broaden your understanding of the immunological differences between innate and specific immunity and how those differences manifest in disorders ranging from gluten and other food sensitivities to more severe manifestations such as celiac disease. In this lecture, titled Spectrum of Gluten-Related Disorders, Dr. Alessio Fasano, Chief of the Division of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition for Massachusetts General Hospital and Director of the Center for Celiac Research, will be discussing cutting-edge research on celiac disease and gluten-related disorders. Be sure to stick around at the end of the lecture, as I'll be giving you information on some of Cell Science Systems' innovative laboratory testing.
All right, afternoon, everybody. It took half of my talk. Yes, I can recommend also for olive oil. I sure can do that. So, of course, when I was invited by the organizers, I was, delighted to come also because the opportunity to see old friends, speakers that we crossroad once in a while. And I think that this is a very fascinating, field. And for somebody like me that learned very recently about, the wisdom of complementary alternative medicine, because I'm in general, on the other side of the fence, I come here with a very unbiased mind to share what is the factual news about, not just celiac disease as the program originally mentioned, but what we now call the gluten-related disorders, because we are in a spectrum of conditions that are related to gluten. I know that you already enjoyed today many lectures discussing a little bit about that. So I think that I want to focus my hour and a half, I think, that I have to talk, or hour to, 1 hour 45, whatever it is, in three major sections, starting to the question, why gluten is so toxic? And again, my job is going to be facilitated, and has been already facilitated by other, speakers that, touch upon this concept. Maybe that we want to go a little bit more on mechanistic details, what we, folks like to talk and in jargon as evidence-based data. So, once upon a time, there was no gluten and there was no celiac disease. And if we look at the evolution of humankind, for what we know right now, that span 2.5 million years, for 99.9% of humankind evolution, our ancestors survived on a gluten-free diet. As a matter of fact, biologically speaking, we were not meant to eat gluten. And it's been already mentioned that gluten came into the picture only 10,000 years ago. So the drop in a bucket of these 2.5 million years, when there was a revolutionary change in lifestyle of our ancestors that shifted their way of living from nomadic, i.e. moving around, chasing food by going after, migration of animals and seasonal crops, to settlers, in which they domesticated food and like animals and crops. In doing that, they invented, quote unquote, or engineered, whatever you want to call it, this tribe of grass family, the order to which wheat, rye, and barley belong to. They are the only grains that contain gluten and similar proteins. They are toxic with people with celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. So all this to say, again, that evolutionarily speaking, we were not meant to eat gluten. I have also to say, though, that if you are sitting here and I'm giving the talk today, and we're not still jumping from one tree to another, it's because of the advent of such a versatile, commodity. As a matter of fact, 800, 8,000, 7,000, 5,000 years ago, wealth was not measured by the number of stocks and bonds you had in a bank, rather by two commodities, oil and wheat. There were the commodities that make you a difference if you were rich or poor. And the reason why, because these commodities can do many things. Not only that, they are not perishable. And that's the reason why, the advent of wheat that was, something in a very limited region, the actual Turkey, to use a jargon that our teenagers use nowadays, went viral because it was so popular and expanded. And it's roughly speed of 1 kilometer a year from south to north and east to west, so that the rest of the world eventually was exposed to gluten. So all this to say, again, that, we give for granted that this, protein and the grains that contain protein has been around forever, and the matter of fact, is not. As a matter of fact, if you, got a chance to visit Italy, and there are several museums in which there are artifacts like, the Magna Graecia artifacts of the Romans that eventually are jars that were, taken from vessels that sink in the Mediterranean Sea. They end up to have grains in there, and the grains that you find there are probably these grains here. These were the Romans and the Greeks that used to eat. Very, simple rudimental grain, had 14 chromosomes, 50,000 genes. Then, again, particularly Egyptians, they start really to become sophisticated to play with these grains and start to really develop this other series of grains, the tetragernin. And that's what we eat right now. There is a mixture of the two. There is a tetraploid, 42 chromosomes, 150,000 genes. I want you to pay attention to this number because we're going to come back later on about what this number means. And therefore, you see also how, not only aesthetically, but trust me on the word, also organoleptically speaking, these grains changed dramatically in these 3,000-4,000 years until, this, modern grain that came, about relatively recently, and up to come on our tables. I love paintings, and this is one of my passion. This is a painting in the 1500s from Belgium. Now, pay attention to this fellow here, and this is a wheat field. Granted, at that time, the folks were not 6'2", 6'3" right now. Nevertheless, see how tall was wheat compared to humankind. Because at that time, the plant was pretty tall, and the seeds, the part that really are useful for us, were just like the 5% top. The rest is just wasted. And in the next century or two, agronomers really play to trying to enrich the seed part so that the yield will be much better. And in doing that, I enrich this plant of its own component, including gluten. And that's pretty much what's the story in terms of the evolution of the grains that really I shrank in 5 minutes, 2.5 million years of evolution of grains. But why it's so special, this gluten? Why it's such a one-of-a-kind protein? Well, first of all, because it gives characteristics to the grain that containing this staple protein that is unparalleled. And that's the reason why it became so popular. You heard that when we say gluten, actually, we mean a mixture of proteins, the two key components being gliadin and glutenin, both toxic for people with celiac disease. Glutenin are this stressed fiber kind of structure that in this electron microscopy are, these fibers here. And gliadins are little blobs that are accommodated in these chambers. Now, the reason why this is one of a kind, that you can do stuff that you cannot do with any other grains that don't contain gluten, is because that structure is the one that gives, grain containing gluten that characteristic that makes this unique, elasticity. That you can't have that with maize or rice. And if you mix this with water and yeast, so much so that you can produce gas, and this gas is entrapped in these chambers, this puffs, grows. So you can have the beautiful croissant, the smelly baguette, you can make the pizza, stop, okay. If you try this with maize, it's not going to work because this is not going to happen there. But with the beauty comes the beast, because if you now zoom in and look at more specifically what this organoleptic characteristic that makes this protein so desirable are based upon, this is also the reason why we got in trouble when we are exposed to this protein. This is a cartoon of the most studied component of gluten that is called alpha-gliadin. Now, I don't pretend that you can read this because I can barely read myself here, but one of the characteristics of this protein that is extremely rich, totally unbalanced, I should say, of two amino acids. They are proline and glutamine. The proline are in P and glutamine in Q, and there are some stretches like this here, for example, almost all Qs. What that means that we are not able to dismantle completely this protein. We cannot digest completely this protein. Indeed, the destiny of any protein that we ingest with the diet is to be completely dismantled in the elemental blocks. They are the amino acids. So if you allow me a parallel, consider this like a pearl necklace in which each amino acid is a pearl. The way that we manage proteins, we break the necklace, and initially we break and open the necklace, and then we cut the necklaces in pieces, and then we pull one pearl at a time so that we can make use of it. With gliadin and gluten in general, so gliadins and glutamines, what we can do, we can break the necklace. We can cut in pieces, but we cannot peel off the amino acids, i.e. the pearls, because we do not have the enzymes that do these tricks, mainly due to this enrichment of the sequence of glutamines, because the enzymes, they are the scissors that cut these proteins, recognize a specific sequence of amino acids. And when they see proline, or glutamine, they don't recognize that sequence as a sequence to be cut, and therefore that piece stays undigested. So to make this a little bit more clear in perspective, and again, if somebody heard this, I apologize that I repeated myself, but if you're so nuts to put the tube in your nose and suck it up a little bit of the juices in the stomach, and you put this in a little vial, a little glass, and put your little finger in there, in a matter of 10, 16 seconds, your meat is gone, and you're going to be gone to the bones. That's what it takes. You put gliadin in there, and 12 hours later, it's still there. Will not go away. Now, it is also important to clarify the notion that in order to induce an immune response from our immune system, the enemy that the immune system goes after, in general, are proteins or fragments of proteins, i.e. peptides. They don't go after the amino acids, because the amino acids that we have are very similar as a pool to the amino acids or anything that we ingest. The cow's proteins, the wheat proteins, the fish proteins. What makes the difference is the sequence of these amino acids that makes, proteins specific for cows as compared to human beings. And because the immune system is there to defend us against enemies, they are not belonging to our body, if we are exposed to fragments of proteins that are not part of our body, what we call non-self, somehow, for example, because we have a leaky gut, then we have an immune response and we generate a collateral damage that we call inflammation. And you heard already the concept, the inflammation is the heart and soul of what is the disease status, no matter what conditions you talk about, no matter what organ you're talking about. I can make an argument that any kind of disease, from cancer to infection, to autoimmunity, to Alzheimer, there is an inflammatory component. So, all this to say, if you have proteins that cannot be completely digested, and it can sit there for hours, and this protein will find the way to sneak through the intestinal barrier, that may create problem. And that's the reason why this can be toxic for many people. I will not say for all, and maybe I'm in disagreement with somebody here, but definitely can create problems. As a matter of fact, as an example, I want to show you here these color-coded fragments. They are not digested. What they do for living. This guy here, this will induce what we call programmed death to cells, apoptosis. But not just the cells of an individual with serious disease, anybody. This fellow here is a super antigen. In other words, will induce a super exaggerated immune response and therefore an exaggerated inflammatory collateral damage when is exposed to the immune system of the host. These two blue guys communicate to the cells to release this protein that you heard a few times today, zonomin, that makes the intestinal leak and therefore create a shortcut so that more enemies will come through and will create problem if you're genetically skewed to do that. And this one here, I'm going to show you in a moment, very interesting fragment that call soldiers, immune cells, on a battlefield, i.e. the intestine, as a requirement to really face this enemy. And when you have the soldiers, these are armed soldiers. And when they got on the battlefield, the intestine, they create collateral damage, that is inflammation. So that's pretty much what we know in terms of mapping out what this fragment, undigested fragment of gluten can do to any of us. Now, there are people that may go through this process and will not even know, and people that will get, at the other end of the spectrum, extremely sick because of that. So, because of these two fragments, and because they can communicate to the cell to release zonomin and make the intestine leak, anybody that eat gluten will have a situation of a leaky gut. Anybody. Not just the people with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, anybody. But the consequence of this, again, can be very different depending who you are. So, what are the steps, if you're genetically skewed, that you go through that eventually will put you over the edge and switch from a state of health of a state of disease? By the way, before that I keep going, am I losing you guys? Am I talking too technical? You sure? Because we'll start all over again, guys. We'll stay here until 10 o'clock. I'm on a mission. As David was with the brain, I'm on a mission with the guts. So, what are the possible steps that you go through when exposed to gluten that can lead to inflammation? And we will discuss also what we mean for inflammation. First and foremost, the very first thing that happens, you leak. And again, tomorrow we're going to get in deep details how this all really happened and what are the clinical consequences of that. The second thing that will happen immediately is that as soon as you have this breach of the intestinal barrier and there's this uncontrolled passage of this fragment and God knows what else, the soldiers are called on the battlefield. Because there is, imagine that you have this middle-aged city with the wall around, and the only way to get into the city is to have this bridge to come down. Now, somebody, blow off the walls, and enemies, attackers are coming in, the soldiers need to come and protect the city. And that's exactly what happened. If the soldiers did their job, everything stops here. And again, you will not have any consequences. But if the army, they're attacking the city, overwhelms the soldiers, then you go to the next step. There is restriction in intestinal mucosa. When I say restriction, it doesn't mean necessarily there is damage, but it's reorganized so that eventually, functionally, change is, characteristics. And then again, if besides to have that kind of genetic predisposition, you have yet an even more complex genetic predisposition, i.e. that eventually you can lose the war because these enemies will overwhelm you, you got the intestinal inflammation. And the intestinal inflammation can go all the way to autodestruction. That is the classical outcome of celiac disease. So you're not going to see anything there because this, I don't think that particularly people in the back. So you got to trust me on this. So what you're seeing here are these finger-like protrusions that we call villi. These are the complex machinery that we have in the intestine that really helps to optimize digestion, absorption, foodstuff. And these villi now are decorated with antibodies to look at the specific gates in between cells. There are technical tight junctions that dictate how leaky is the gut or how permeable is the intestine, either way. So, and this is a blow-up of, what we see in a normal situation. Typically, what you see is the decoration of these, antibodies at the edge of neighboring cells. And when you see these chicken wire, characteristics, that means these doors are closed, these tight junctions are competent, and therefore we are tightly control the trafficking of antigens from the environment into our body. This happened to be a mouse, and eventually the same mouse later on was gouged with only 1 milligram of gluten, that's all. And in a matter of 20 minutes, these gates from closed became totally open. Totally open. So there is a completely open up of these gates, and therefore these enemies now, they are in the environment, and the lumen can come through. So the bottom line is what you just saw and what we just discussed are 3 steps that are now well known and thank God accepted by the scientific community. Eat gluten. Gluten is only partially digested. Some of this fragment communicate with the cell to release zonin. Zonin that is released is the one that is responsible for that phenomenon I just showed you, i.e. from door closed to door open, and that makes the intestine to leak, so the fragment gluten and what else will come in, and now the enemy is in the wall of the city. It's within the city, and now the war is moved from outside to inside. And here, where all the immune system will eventually dictate the destiny of if this is going to be clinically evident with disease or the mess will be cleaned up and we will not even know what's going on. The step number 2, once you got to this situation, is that these soldiers are cold on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to show you a movie. I don't know how much we're going to be able to see this, but we're going to give it a try. So let me explain first what you're seeing here. First of all, the guy in the back there, do you see anything? No, we will let you know later on. Okay, you do. Maybe if we can bring the lights slightly down, that will help, maybe. But anyhow, so look at the cartoon underneath it first so we can understand what we're looking at. These are these finger-like protrusions that are the villi that I was telling you about. Imagine that now you cut the villi, in the transversal way. Now you have the cross section. So you have this finger-like protrusion, you cut them, and now you look from the top, okay? So what you see now is the cross section of the villi in which the core here is the core of the villi, this single layer of the cells are the epithelial cells that cover the intestine, and this is the environment outside the intestine, okay? What you see here is the cross-section of this core of the villus. This black stuff here are the capillaries. And these green dots that you will see a little bit better are the soldiers, are neutrophils. They are particularly treated in these transgenic animals with the fruit fly gene that makes them to be fluorescent, okay? So what you're going to see now is on the left, these are the villi of a mouse that has been exposed to another protein, BSA. This is the mouse that has been gavaged with gluten. And this is pretty much what you're going to see there. So see how many of these soldiers are stuck on the wall of the capillaries here, and then eventually start to move out and get into the external part, what we call the lamina propria. While this guy here, they keep traveling, and they stay in the lumen. So in the animals that was exposed to gluten, gluten is attracting the soldiers outside of the capillary, and they start to really get on the battlefield where gluten, and God knows again what else, is sitting in there because it's been, absorbed through this breach of the barrier. While these guys, they keep going. Again, I mean, who is close by may see that. But even if you're not that close, you see the mess that is happening here. And this is all due to the simple difference that here you have bovine serum albumin, and here you have gluten. That's all. Wow, indeed. I need the light because I don't see a freaking thing here. All right. So, to summarize, what is the destiny? What happened when somebody eat a McDonald's, Big Mac? Well, there are 3 steps. Step one, number one, that is what we call the epithelial events, and the timeline is very short. The movie that you saw, by the way, was a 60 minutes kind of business that was compressed in a minute. But within 60 minutes, you have the breach of this barrier, the leaky gut, and the soldiers that come right away to face the enemy. But again, because they have to use weapons, they are creating inflammation. So if you're a Joe Schmo and you eat gluten, the gluten is only partially digested, communicated with the cell, the zone is released, the intestine got leak, the gluten and other stuff comes here. And for what we understand, for the vast majority of the people, these soldiers that come on the fair front will clean up the mess, and we don't even know that that happened. That's probably the destiny of the vast majority of people. There are other people, though, that when they got to that point and the soldiers come on the battlefield, they got so excited about the presence of these non-self antigens. Again, it's not just gluten, who knows what else. They start to really fight very adamantly to get rid of these enemies. And they use very powerful weapons that we call cytokines or chemokines. And again, when you shoot, there is collateral damage. And that collateral damage can translate in inflammation, and that inflammation can translate in symptoms. And these are typically symptoms that are engaged when only the innate immune branch of the immune response is involved. What we are depicting here is the typical example of a situation of gluten sensitivity. Now, if you go to the third level, that beside the innate immune branch, the adaptive immune branch is involved with the HLA and all 9 yards, the reticular cells and so on and so forth, the B lymphocytes that produce antibodies and so on and so forth. Now you're talking about 1% of the population. Now you're talking about the people with celiac disease that eventually will have as a consequence the auto-insult and the auto-destruction in the intestine that is typical of celiac disease. That's pretty much it. If I was here 3 years ago, all this was totally unknown, totally unknown. That's the news number one, why gluten is toxic. News number two, until the recent past, we thought that gluten is equal celiac disease, and that created a tremendous amount of confusion, particularly among my most traditional and conservative colleagues. They say, agreed, there is the dogma. If you got sick with gluten, you have to have celiac disease. If you do the test and you're negative for celiac disease, gluten is not a problem, don't waste your time. Don't waste your time with the diet and so on and so forth, because the dogma is you don't have a celiac disease, you don't have a problem with gluten. Now, look at this. Anybody knows what is Google Trend? Nope? Okay. For those that don't know this, well, don't feel sorry, because I was like you until the recent past. When my son, 13, now 14, showed me about this powerful tool on Google, he was looking at the trend of skirting girls in the United States over time. I told him, what the heck are you doing? He said, this is a science project at school. Or the length of the skirt of the girls. I said, who approved that project? Anyhow, so you can compare also different things. For example, in this case, I compared 3 diets, very popular diets, 2 of them at least, and I want you to really pay attention to the timeline. We're not talking about 1804, we're talking about 2004 here. The low-carb diet in yellow, the fat-free diet in red, and the gluten-free diet in blue. The gluten-free diet at that time was a ridiculous market, less than $100 million. Now, see the trend over time. From 2008 over, gluten crossed the other lines and never looked back. As a matter of fact, we're talking about this number has been just recently updated to $4.6 billion in retail that we had in 2011. And the projection is close to $8 billion with a B dollars a year. By the end of this day, 60 million Americans will consume a gluten-free product. Now, keep in mind that the projected number of celiacs in the United States is 3 million, of which only 300,000 roughly have been diagnosed. So who the heck are these other 60 million people? If gluten is good, if the gluten-free diet is good only for people with celiac disease, who the heck are all these other people? So there is definitely a fat factor of the diet. It may well be. It may well be. So, if Lady Gaga, August 2012, decided to go on a gluten-free diet because she told me, I want to lose weight, I said, you got to be nuts. Have you guys seen Lady Gaga nearby? She's really anorexic. I don't think that she has to lose any other weight. But, she decided to go on a gluten-free diet for that. But again, no, I would be dishonest by saying there is no such a thing as a fat factor. However, by the same token, if we want to be honest, we also have to admit that besides celiac disease, there are other conditions for which the gluten-free diet becomes a medical necessity. That is not just celiac disease. And these are the people that if they eat gluten, they are sick, no matter how you want to see it. And the only way for them to be relieved of the pain of the joint, the foggy mind, or whatever you heard already, is to be gluten-free. And indeed, the ones that are on a gluten-free diet for non-medical necessity are the ones that are occasional consumers. And again, I don't know what to make out of this, folks, because honestly, they have all the rights to do whatever they want. Because if they feel more energetic, or they feel fine, or because they want to go back the way that our ancestors used to live in terms of lifestyle, they have all the rights to do that. But the ones that are medical necessity, they capture very much my attention, because these are the people that come to clinic. These are the ones that are sick. They are out of the commission. And again, our mistake for many, many years was that we were totally blinded to anything other than celiac disease, the autoimmune response to exposure to gluten. Prevalence roughly 1%. Sure, we knew also that there is a wheat allergy component, much rarer than celiac disease. But again, what we missed, and we just learned relatively recently, is the third kid on the block here. This non-celiac gluten sensitivity that, as you heard already, has mainly an innate immune component that drives the inflammatory process. Well, let's talk a little bit about these conditions. About celiac disease, I don't want to spend too much time because I have so many other things that are interesting to talk about. This has been said many times. But again, to set the record straight for those that don't know the history of medicine, that it's always a matter of wisdom to dig into history of medicine. We didn't know that gluten was the culprit of celiac disease for a long time. This condition supposedly was described the first time 2,008 years ago by a Greek, doctor. But it was this fellow here, a Dutch pediatrician, very recently, that connected dots and linked celiac disease with gluten. Matter of fact, he made a very interesting observation. Before he discovered this link, the destiny of these kids was not great. 1/3 of them, 35%, would die of celiac disease. That was the destiny. The way that worked was that if somebody will eventually make the suspected diagnosis, a pediatrician, then we'll send these kids to the hospital, and the doctor at the hospital will say, yes, this is celiac disease. Go home and come back in 3-6 months. If your son or daughter is still alive, you can take them back. That was the destiny. And during these 3-6 months in the hospital, the only thing that these kids were fed were bananas. That's the reason why they're called banana babies. There's still few around. Now, nevertheless to say that who made through would never touch, smell, or look at anything yellow in their lives. Because this was really horrible, horrible. Then this guy made an interesting epidemiological observation. He realized that during World War II, when there was scarcity of wheat flour, rather than use wheat flour, people will use potato starch flour. The mortality went to 0. And research phased to 35% when the war was over and wheat was available again. To prove the concept, he did a clinical trial that now will be not only laughable, but nobody will eventually, even any epidemiologist will kick your ass and say, get out of my face. 6 kids, that's all. He took 6 kids and gave them gluten, make them sick, took gluten away, and then make better. That was it. And this happened in the early 50s, 1950s. Before this pivotal experiment or clinical trial, whatever you want to call it, we had no clue what was the problem. And matter of fact, the fact that it was gluten in wheat that created the problem became clear only at the end of the 50s, early 60s. So this is something very, very recent. Fast forward to 2013, we learned so much more. We thought that this was an exclusive pediatric condition. It's not anymore. We thought that this was a food allergy. It is not anymore. We thought that to have celiac disease, you have to have fair skin. You have got to be from the North Pole. You have to be first cousin on Santa Claus. It's not true anymore. What we now know, that this is bona fide a true autoimmune disease. One of a kind, but still an autoimmune disease. Why one of a kind? It does have the same ingredients of the recipe. You have to be genetically predisposed. Peculiarity number 1. Many genes involved, like many other autoimmune diseases, like MS, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, and so on and so forth, but with an unbelievable penetrance of these 2 genes here, DQ2 and DQ8. There are these HLA genes. They are present in almost the totality of people with celiac disease, 97, 98%. There is no other conditions with such high penetrance. Diabetes, there are similar HLA, haplotypes, but we're talking about 70%. Rheumatoid arthritis, 65%. Here we talk about 98 plus. True, 1/3 of the general population will have these genes will never develop celiac disease. So having this gene doesn't mean that you have celiac disease. It means you are genetically compatible. And we in clinic look at these genes not to confirm celiac disease, rather to exclude it, because the negative predictive value, i.e. that you can predict that somebody does not have celiac disease if they don't have this gene, is extremely, extremely high. Peculiarity number one. Peculiarity number two, the autoantigen that is responsible for the immune response against our own body is known. It's this enzyme called tissue transglutaminase. Matter of fact, the antibodies against these enzymes, the anti-TTG antibodies, is one of the best and most sensitive and specific tests in human biology for diagnostics that we have. Very sensitive, very specific. But what really sets celiac disease aside to any other immune disease is the second element of this equation, the environment. We don't know what makes people sick with diabetes or MS or rheumatoid arthritis. It is indeed gluten, the undisputable trigger of celiac disease. So much so that if you put these people on a gluten-free diet, and we all know this is the treatment of celiac disease, and we do this right, the symptoms go away, the autoantibodies go away, the autoimmune insult, i.e. the damage of the intestine, will go away. If this individual will not share with you that he or she has celiac disease, there is absolutely no way to find it out. Now, you need to really appreciate what happened in the scientific community when celiac disease was moved out from food allergies and was put into the autoimmunity, pot. The wisdom that is still strong among many people is that celiac disease, the autoimmunity is a one-way street. When you got there, there is nothing you can do about it. It's a way no return. The autoimmune system, the immune system goes in automatic, and your destiny is that you will be consumed by the autoimmune disease. Celiac disease is telling otherwise. It's telling us if you find a way to stop this interplay between the genes you're born with and the trigger from the environment, you can stop the autoimmune process and you can bring everything back. And now this is used as a one-of-a-kind autoimmune model to study conditions for which we have no understanding what are the triggers from the environment. What is the results when these two elements, genes and environment, they come together? That's been the other confusion. You look in a classic textbook, that's what you look at. What we called in the past the classic celiac disease. Again, pediatric conditions, Caucasians, typical GI symptoms like, chronic diarrhea, big belly, lack of appetite, failure to thrive, and so on and so forth. When I was in medical school, they told me, this is the common denominator. You don't have to run tests or do anything to these kids. Look at the parents. If they have the hair up in the air, bag under the eyes, and the kids is pissed off, this is celiac disease unless they prove otherwise. That was the way that I was taught to make the diagnosis. Now, this is a picture taken in London in the late 30s. If you look at something like this, the first thing that click in your mind, it should click in your mind at least, are the malnourished kids of the third world country, because they look exactly the same. These are malnourished kids, by all means. It's like kwashiorkor. The difference being that the malnourished kids in the third world country, they look like this because they don't have food. These kids look like that because they have all the food of this world, but will just go through, because it would not be digested and absorbed, and therefore it's like they were starving. And that's the reason why they were dying. Now, look very, very carefully to this picture. Because if you will see anybody in your clinic like that, take your iPad, iPod, iPhone, something, and take a picture. Because you're not going to see this anymore. This is extremely, extremely rare. Extremely rare. What you see now is this. This is the real celiac disease. the list is too long to go through all this. It suffices to say that rather to be a gastrointestinal disorder, celiac disease is truly a systemic disease. There is no organ or tissue of our body that is spared by the autoimmune inflammatory attack triggered by celiac disease. And this goes back to a concept that I've been telling now for a long time, and I apologize again to repeat myself. The gut is not like Las Vegas. What happened in the gut does not stay in the gut. So if you have these attackers that come through and the immune cells are activated, sometimes these immune cells, they stay in the gut, they stay just in there, and you create inflammation that create the typical GI symptoms. But some other times, once they're activated, they leave the gut, they go somewhere else. They go in the joint, and they do joint pain. They go in the skin, and you will have the blistery, condition that's called dermatitis pediformis. They go to the brain, and you develop, symptoms that can go from headaches all the way to, seizures. And I can go on and on and on. As a matter of fact, the most frequent way the disease presents itself nowadays, sure enough, is not diarrhea, weight loss. It's anemia and chronic fatigue. That's by far the most frequent way the disease presents itself nowadays. Long story short, this is a clinical chameleon. If you don't know what you're dealing with, and you are an hematologist that you're looking at an individual that has anemia that is not corrected by iron supplementation, and you don't know about celiac disease, the risk is that this guy will go through gazillions of tests, taking tons of iron, that you can build a second Eiffel Tower, and that will not solve the problem, when the solution should be very simple under your nose. Now, I was skeptical because I also was among the folks that believe that the problem with gluten has to be celiac disease. And I was really reluctant to really change the state of mind because I didn't see it. I just didn't see coming. And again, this is a shortcoming, guys, when you have two camps with a wall, not a line in the sand, a wall that is, the conventional medicine and the complementary alternative medicine that don't talk each other. I mean, that's the reality of the story. So I think that the best way to exemplify how moron I was is to present the case. This is a lovely lady, 40 years old, with a history of stomachache and heartburn. So a reflux, classical gastroesophageal reflux. She was put on, the purple pill, and sure enough, the reflux didn't go away. There's also not a major, strange outcome. I don't know if you know, when, proton pump inhibitors were, approved by the FDA, the clinical trials, efficacy was 38%. 38% means that already 2 out of 3 people that take the purple pill would not respond. That's pretty much it. But that's not what really worried the situation. The situation was really taking, to turn for the worse here. A month later, she started to develop headache, dizziness, numbness of fingers, and paresthesia. And the primary physician immediately got extremely concerned because she thought that her patient was going through a situation of multiple sclerosis. And indeed, I believe correctly so, first thing that she did was an MRI and evoked potentials, and thank God, everything was negative. Then other conditions were entertained, like Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, pernicious anemia, lupus, everything was negative. So, now it's 2 months passed by, she has these problems, and they don't know what's wrong with her. Because of this persistence of the symptoms for the reflux, and for no other reasons, she underwent to an endoscopy that was reported as normal. The only thing that they said, there was a slight increase in the soldiers in the forefront, what we call technically the intraepithelial lymphocytes. She was also screened for celiac disease and tested negative, meaning that she had anti-tissue transglutaminase antibodies negative. The only thing that she had positive were the anti-gliadin antibodies of a class IgG. But because the TTG was negative, she was told that she had no celiac disease and therefore no business to go on a gluten-free diet. She came to us for a second opinion. I gave the same response. This was roughly 7 years ago. So I said, look, your antibodies are negative. This anti-gluten antibodies doesn't mean too much. You need to go back and regroup and definitely focus on other conditions, because otherwise you miss the boat here, and eventually you're not going to be treated correctly. Despite that advice, she went on a gluten-free diet and managed to come back to me, not for anything, but to tell me how moron I was. Because she said, call me whatever. Maybe that I don't have celiac disease, I don't dispute that. But within a week, my neurological symptoms pretty much resolved. I only have some occasional tingling. And within 3 weeks, all my GI symptoms are gone, the reflux and so on and so forth. So what is gluten sensitivity? What we define as gluten sensitivity? Well, again, now we have been convened twice, one in London 3 years ago and the other one in Munich last year, to try really to grasp the concept of what it is so that we can understand each other. At least we can give definition. So what we came up with, you can imagine the amount of animosity about this around the table to discuss the matter, is what it is not. So we can tell for sure that the people that have gluten sensitivity, they react to exposure to gluten, but both allergic and autoimmune mechanisms have been ruled out, meaning that all the tests for checking for wheat allergy are negative. The serology tests for celiac disease are negative. The biopsy is normal. They may have, indeed, these anti-gluten antibodies positive, not all of them. And the symptoms are present, but they are not of any help because they overlap tremendously with celiac disease, so cannot distinguish on a clinical ground. And they resolve the symptoms following implementation of the gluten-free diet, possibly on doing a double-blind double-blind challenge so that you avoid the placebo effect. That was the definition that was given in London. This is our experience, our center, because, in the last 7 years, we've been digging into this. And again, as usual happened to us, we were super duper crucified about this. But our numbers, and again, these are estimates that means nothing, because if I have to tell you how frequent it is, the answer is I don't know, because we don't have tests like we do have for wheat allergy and celiac disease have been validated to make, these numbers, strong and valid. In our experience, based on the criteria I just told you, roughly 6%, meaning 6 times more people than celiacs, seems to be affected with this condition. What are the symptoms? These are the list. On the top of the list, abdominal pain. These folks are diagnosed or labeled as IBS. And as a matter of fact, now there are clinical trials published, double-blind and so on and so forth, that support the notion. 40% eczema, 1/3 with headache. This is fascinating to me, this foggy mind. I tried the gluten-free diet strict for myself. I still foggy-minded, so I got to have something else. Also, my fatigue did not resolve. So 1/3 of people, they have fatigue, diarrhea, depression. So you see the list of the symptoms. There is no way that you can distinguish people with gluten sensitivity with celiac disease. There are tremendous overlap there. So this is the classification that we designed to give to the situation here of the gluten-related disorder based on the pathogenesis. Autoimmune, you talk about celiac disease. Allergic, you talk about wheat allergy. Non-autoimmune, non-allergic, possibly innate immunity. Now the question mark is pretty much out of there, gluten sensitivity. The problem again, that while we have biomarker for celiac disease and wheat allergy, we don't have biomarker for gluten sensitivity yet. We're working on it. Several people there trying to validate the biomarkers. This is a table that I put together more for myself. It's a cheat sheet to really navigate what are the differences between among these 3 conditions. And again, based on different parameters, you can really have an educated guess what you're dealing with. For example, the time interval between gluten exposure and certain symptoms can be measured in years with celiac disease. We know that people that can eat gluten for 50 years and then develop celiac disease later on. Not definitely gluten sensitivity. We're talking about a much short period of time. We're talking about hours or days, while with allergy can be minutes. You can develop anaphylaxis in a matter of seconds, by the way. Pathogenesis, we know that by definition celiac disease is autoimmune. Gluten sensitivity, now again, there is quite a strong consensus in innate immune, and allergic for, of course, with allergy. HLA, tremendous penetrance, as I was telling you, the HLA here. Gluten sensitivity is half away, 50% the HLA positive, 50% are negative, while the general population is 30-35%. That is pretty much what we see with allergy. Autoantibodies, by definition, are almost present here, always absent here. The enteropathy, so the autoimmune insult, is also always present here, never here. Here there is only an increase of this intraepithelial lymphocytes, but not damage of the villi. Symptoms, complete overlap, you can make a distinction. Complications, we know there are comorbidity with celiac disease, long-term complications like, diabetes, Hashimoto, you can develop osteoporosis and so on and so forth. As far as we know so far, we don't know, but it seems that there are no such a thing. In other words, a comorbidity with gluten sensitivity. So, what are the take-home message in terms of diagnosis? This is not rare, cannot be distinguished from celiac disease purely on a clinical basis, can present with vague non-specific symptoms like IBS-like. A gluten-free diet can be considered only when another form of gluten reaction, another cause of the patient seems to have been ruled out. This is an important concept, guys, because if you give it a try on a gluten-free diet, the tools to establish in which part of the spectrum this individual is are gone. The autoantibodies will not be positive anymore. So, and because for celiac disease, this is a commitment for life and needs to be done in a very strict, compliant way, you got to rule out celiac disease. And before that, you give it a try with this diet to see if you're dealing with gluten sensitivity. That one is for me, not for you. Listen to your patients. I got to do that. So, where are we with the time?
45 minutes.
Wonderful. So, I'm going to dig into the most controversial questions about gluten sensitivity. Not for you guys, but for the other side of the coin here. Schizophrenia and autism. There is a huge debate, far from being settled, if indeed gluten has anything to do with these two conditions. And again, particularly for, autism, there is an aura about, the intervention and the gluten and casein, how they can eventually be part of it and so on and so forth. Well, there are two papers that just been published, back to back, one from our group and the other one from Peter Green's group in New York. Now, you see here the anti-glidin antibodies level. These are, again, the old anti-glidin antibodies, well, the ones that we poo-pooed, they said we don't want to use anymore, blah, blah, blah. They have been, reshoveled back. And you see in red the autistic kids versus the unaffected sibling versus the healthy controls. You see both IgG, particular IgG, less IgA, how this is more elevated in kids with autism. So it seems that at least a subgroup of kids with autism, they may have elevated anti-glidin IgG antibodies. And then you see here the comparison of glidin, deamidated glidin, and TTG. By definition, TTG is negative, and that's created tremendous, again, confusion, because people that were skeptical about this role of gluten in autism say, if these kids, they don't have celiac disease, how can they have a problem with gluten? And again, now I believe there is an open mind approach that gluten can give you problems outside celiac disease. But this, once again, you see that it is the anti-glidin antibody, the IgG, and not the deamidated or TTG that they have a problem, that they give a problem. A much more complex study was done and published. Actually, this is not in press anymore, it's out, in which, what the heck is going on here? But anyhow, in which pretty much, these kids, these are still kids with autism, but these are kids on a regular diet compared to the ones that go on a gluten-free diet. And you see how the antibodies will go down once these kids will be placed on a gluten-free diet. So you have anti-gliadin IgA antibodies, anti-gliadin IgG antibodies, they all pretty much will go down when they go on a gluten-free diet. And here you see the same phenomenon here, but also the total IgA and the milk IgA antibodies, same destiny. When they go on a gluten-free diet and casein-free diet, these antibodies, they go down. So definitely, the culprit, instigator, that is gluten and casein in this case, are the ones that drive this increase in antibodies that go back to normal when these kids they are placed on an elimination diet. Gluten and schizophrenia is an unbelievable field, and again, I don't have the time to go through, but again, this is a matter that's been discussed for ages. And once again, back to World War II, people, they made interesting observation. On one side of the pond, i.e. Europe, there was scarcity of wheat during the war, and the number of schizophrenic cases decreased dramatically. On this other side of the pond, we still have wheat in the United States, actually, because of the scarcity of meat and other, commodities. There was an overuse of wheat, and there was an increase of people with schizophrenia that were admitted in mental hospitals. So that was, how this debate started. And, and then there was these papers, there was this gluten connection association between schizophrenia and celiac disease, and then this paper that really settled the debate, because once again, the skeptical say, if gluten would be important to instigate the schizophrenia, you will expect that rather than be 1%, the prevalence of celiac disease among schizophrenic patients should be 10, 15, 20%. It is not the case. It's 2%. That means 98% of these people, they have no business to go on a gluten-free diet. Here, this paper was the first of a series of papers. This was published by our group and then followed by at least another 3 groups. This was in 2009, already now 4 years, in which gluten sensitivity turns to be responsible for almost 20% of the case of schizophrenic patients. And again, this is another paper that followed after that, and once again, these other papers that talk about the recent onset psychosis and multiple episodes of schizophrenia, and finally, in China, that we thought that China didn't have celiac disease. What an interesting epidemiological phenomenon there. When the first McDonald's opened on Tiananmen Square, and now it's using the staple gluten versus rice is a social statement. That means you are, claiming the ladder of the wealth in China. And we see in parallel this increase of gluten-related disorders, including the situation with schizophrenia in China. So how this comes about? There are 2 non-mutually exclusive theories how gluten can create problem in terms of behavior. One that they both start the same way. You eat gluten, partially digested, leaky gut comes in, and there is this cells that will go after, you have seen in that movie, and they're armed. Now, the problem is that once they got there, one theory said, well, there is no inflammatory business here. This fragment that come through, some of them, they are structurally similar to chemicals that control our behavior. They are called endorphins. As a matter of fact, from gliadin, they are called glidorphins. For casein, they call casomorphins. I'm pretty sure that you know all this. And eventually, once absorbed, they go through the bloodstream and go to the blood-brain barrier, reach the brain, and make these people change behavior. And depending on their genetic background, they can develop schizophrenia, autism, or whatever. The other theory that is more the inflammatory theory that's taking more and more steam, because now we have evidence in animal models, not only that, but on biopsies, on cadavers, and autopsies and so on and so forth, is that again, when these steps they come and these cells are activated, because again, the gut is not like Las Vegas, some of this, they travel and they go to the brain and they create a state of neuroinflammation. Now, we have evidence of that. This is a paper that we just published The increase is the increase of this enzyme, the transglutaminase 6, that is an isoform that is specific for the brain. TTG2 is the gut, TTG3 is the skin, TTG6 is the brain. We see a huge elevation of TTG antibodies in a very large proportion of schizophrenic patients. So much so that we believe that this represents a biomarker of a gluten-driven schizophrenic neuroinflammation process. How many people we're talking about? We're talking about roughly 15–20% of schizophrenic patients. That means that 80% eventually, if this is true, will not respond to the gluten-free diet. So the idea, the working hypothesis again, you eat gluten, partially digested, the fragment that releases insulin, leaky gut, this is activated, these folks will eventually either stay in the gut and create the enteropathy or travel to the brain. The brain, when they got to the brain, you damage the cells, the enzymes, TTG6, that is an intracellular enzyme, leaks out. The antibodies, that the immune system never seen this enzyme before, consider this something that it does not belong to our body, we mount an immune response that eventually can be detected in the blood as a biomarker of neuroinflammation. And we're using that to do the ultimate proof. We're doing a clinical trial in which we take schizophrenic patients with positive anti-TTG antibodies, TTG6 antibodies, we bring in-house because they would not comply with the diet, and they go on a gluten-free diet. Now we have a handful of patients that are part of this report. Amazing results. No drugs whatsoever. These folks are almost together as I am. It's not mean that much, but you know. And this is the clinicaltrial.gov where you see that this clinical trial is registered. I will spend my last what is that? Time. 25 minutes on the most exciting part that I want to share with you. This, I'm very passionate because after all, I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. And in general, I'm known among my young patients as the poop doctor. Now we're going to talk about shit. Are we recording this? We are. Oops. We're talking about poop. So the idea about the evolution of autoimmune diseases, as I told you, it was always based on the question, you're born with those genes, it is destiny. You will develop celiac disease. You will develop diabetes. You will develop breast cancer, Alzheimer, whatever, because it's destiny. You're born with these genes and it's destiny. You already heard from Dave that actually now people start to think about epigenetics and that the story changes and so on and so forth. But what is behind this epigenetic concept? So it is fantasy or is factual? Well, tomorrow we will talk about a little bit more about the recipe for pathogenesis of autoimmune diseases because we spoke at length about the genetic component and the environmental today. We spoke very little about this mucosal barrier, just a touch, but tomorrow that's what we're going to discuss, mostly. But, if these indeed genes and environment are important, and you see these epidemics, look at the epidemics of autism spectrum disorder. I mean, and look at the timeline here. We're not talking about centuries, we're talking about decades. If you have these epidemics, cannot be due to mutation of genes. Genes, they change, the mutation genes are measured in centuries. It takes generation to mutate a gene. This is in a single generation, we're seeing these tremendous epidemics from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 88. That's what we're facing right now with autism. With celiac disease is even more mind-blowing because, stay with me for a second. Because we know the environmental trigger, our proposition, our dogma was, you're born with the genes of celiac disease, You eat gluten, and gluten comes undisputably in the first year of life when baby food comes in. That's the time in which the autoimmune process starts. Now, if you develop symptoms at 2 years of age or 72, it depends how aggressive is the immune system. The more aggressive, the more damage you create in the intestine, the sooner you develop symptoms. The more slow-paced, the more time it would take. That was the premises. And then we did this study that was focused and aimed at total different reasons that really trashed this out of the window. Now, talking about the difficulty to publish a paper, if I tell you the tribulation to go through this, first of all, to myself, to believe this study, this was a cohort of 3,000 healthy adults followed for 50-plus years. The purpose of the study, we wanted to know that 1%, i.e. 30 people, that have celiac disease, how they switch from no symptoms to symptoms over time. That was the purpose. We were shocked to learn that in this period of time, celiac disease doubled every 15 years. Now, these are the same Joe Schmoes, though there is no mutation here. So in the 70s, 1 in 500, 1 in 250 in the 90s, and in the 2000, 1%. There were people that were eating gluten for 56, there were 2 ladies that were eating gluten for 70 years. They had no problem whatsoever with it. And all of a sudden, they lost the luxury to tolerate gluten, and they switched from tolerance, i.e. state of health, to disease, and they developed celiac disease. So, sure, you got to have the genes. Absolutely, you have to have the environment. But to develop the autoimmune insult, you got to have something else, because they are necessary but not sufficient. So what else we're talking about? Now, these 2 questions are the holy grail of the, future of the desire of the impossible mission that we're going after. First question, what kind of tricks these 2 ladies used to tolerate something that is indisputably a trigger of autoimmunity? Because if we learn how they did that, imagine what we can do. Imagine what can we do. Prevention, primary prevention of all diseases of humankind, that's what you're talking about. That is an impossible mission, and I believe who's going to win, this is going to win the Nobel Prize, who's going to figure it out. I would definitely play bocce by then. The second, that is more approachable, is what happened to them that made them to lose that luxury. They lost the capability to tolerate gluten. So how we rewrite the natural history of celiac disease? The epidemic of celiac disease is driven by many factors. They are not all mutually exclusive. The quality of gluten, the quantity of gluten, the breastfeeding, the maturity of gut function. But this guy here, the change of the bacteria that live with us, it is now the ones that's been extremely, it's been the focus on extremely aggressive, studies by many, many researchers. What is interesting that if you talk about the microbiome, there are already 29 papers published on the matter. Most are cross-sectional studies, so they take a population of kids with celiac disease, a population of kids without celiac disease at a certain age, they compare them. There is only one prospective study that we finished relatively recently in which you take kids from birth and you follow over time. And you see who develops celiac disease, who does not, and see what kind of different composition of bacteria they have in their guts. So, why the microbiome is important? We know already, for example, by this study, that if you're born by C-section, so that you do not inherit bacteria from your mother, the chance that you develop celiac disease, as a matter of fact, many other diseases, is 2-3 times more than normal vaginal delivery. Because if those bacteria that live in peace with our mother will be transmitted to us during normal delivery, they probably live in peace with our genes as well, because we're genetically similar to our mothers. But if we are born by C-section, bad guys and good guys will come in. Some that will live in peace, and some will be very belligerent. So this is a study that we published, again, very recently, that changed completely the landscape. And in my humble opinion, it's representing a shift of paradigm, at least the way that I think about this entire ordeal. Why? Because, there is no question, at least, well, let's put it this way. I thought that there was no question that we are the most sophisticated beings on the face of the earth. I mean, after all, have you seen a congregation of ants to have a meeting like this, or chimpanzees? No. We are definitely the most sophisticated, dogs around the block here. I don't know about you guys, but when the Human Genome Project was completed and found out that this is 25,000 now. We're made by only 25,000 genes. My self-esteem went to the toilet. We are genetically rudimental. When we were in elementary school to section the worm, the one that live under the ground, we're talking about 90,000 genes there, the worm. Do you remember what I told you? Pay attention to that number, the genes in wheat, 150,000 genes. So wheat, a plant, is 5 times more complex than we are, genetically speaking. Not only that, but we are 99.95% identical to chimpanzees. Only 400 genes different. We are 92% identical to a mouse. A mouse. Have you ever seen a mouse that give a speech? Or did you entertain in a political discussion with a mouse? So how come that we're so complex? Unless we do not open our mind and realize that we live from birth to death, together with a parallel civilization, there is this complex, mix of bacteria that together generate 100 times more genes than we are, then we would not understand our complexity. So in other words, it is my opinion that we're made of 2 genomes. The human genomes, very rudimental, that we inherited from both parents, that is stable. If there is defective in the genome, will not go away because, if you have the genes for celiac disease or autism or schizophrenia or Alzheimer, will not go away. And that's the end of the story. But we also have a second genome that is microbiome that, again, as I told you, if we're lucky, we inherited from our mothers, and different from the human genome is extremely dynamic, can change all the time. And that's the essence of epigenetics. So in other words, if you consider, and forgive me again, I showed this many times, but if you consider the human genome as a piano with 30,000 notes or 25,000, whatever we have, one for each gene, and let's say that 300 of these notes are defective because if you struck this, you play the song celiac or diabetes or whatever you like it, that piano would not give any sound unless there is a piano player, i.e. somebody that sit there and play the piano. And the piano player, in my humble opinion, is the microbiome. That is extremely dynamic. It can change over time. Depends who sits at the piano. You have different kind of music comes out. So back to these 2 ladies that for 70 years were able to tolerate gluten. Let's say that they have, for 70 years, Elton John sitting there, touching 200 to 300 notes that you got to touch in order to play the song Celiac. Despite that they had those genes, they didn't develop it. And let's say that at some point, when they turned in the 70s, they had a surgery, they took antibiotics, they took a trip to Cancun to have fun down there, or, whatever. Now they have the microbiome that changed from this guy, let's say, to Ray Charles. Ray Charles now can touch all the notes, and here we go, to play the song of celiac even at 70. Because this is the only way that I can explain the unexplicable. And how you can figure it out, now we have a way. I.e., when these 2 parallel worlds, the human genome and the microbiome, will play together, what you do, you activate specific metabolic pathways. And when you do that, you produce, substances, metabolites, that can tell you who is sitting at the piano. So, if you hear music pop, so you have a metabolic profile that suggests that this guy is sitting, you know they are safe, because this guy cannot touch all the genes that make you develop celiac disease. But if you, all of a sudden, you see this coming up, you know that this guy is sitting there, and therefore it's a matter of time, and this individual will develop whatever. Is this fantasy? Absolutely not, guys. Let me go straight to the point. So this is, for example, the metabolome analysis of this prospective studies that I was telling you about celiac disease. Yeah, right. I don't see that either. What is 15, 10, 5? What is that? What? 20. I'm done. No, I'm done. So see this blue line. This was a kid that developed celiac disease. Look at this black line. This is a kid that developed type 1 diabetes. Now, that metabolite that happens to be lactate, that is a metabolite produced by a microorganism that is a good guy, that's called lactobacillus, went up, and as soon as it started to go down, 6 months later, this guy lost tolerance, developed celiac disease. This is incomplete, but it was the same story. This guy went up and then went down, and roughly 2.5 years, this guy developed type 1 diabetes. So if this pilot study can be expanded to large numbers, do you realize what we have in our hands here? The power to see in the future who is going to come down with an autoimmune process. Imagine that. Imagine that. If you take the urine and look at metabolites, now you can start to segregate who are the normal people, the one in red, in black, who are the siblings of people with autism, the one in blue, and the ones that have autism, they are way different from the others. Magic? No. This is what we're going to do in terms of profession of our, our profession here. Same story here. You see control here, autistic here, well separated. So what is pretty much the future and how this really translated? Let me go straight to the point. The best way to predict the future is to create it. Yes, it's cheating, but this is the way to do it. Because if we create it, we know what's going to happen. And the reason why there is a lot of animosity between traditional medicine and complementary medicine is because we see life in a polarized way. We are both wrong, and there is a word of wisdom when you say it's like dating. You got to really give in a little bit and find ourselves on a common ground. How? What I'm talking about? Classical example. Traditional medicine debated this issue on a gluten-free diet, is true, not true, and so on and so forth, and go for what they call the Cochrane analysis, that is the ultimate way to say who is right, who is wrong. And the Cochrane analysis concluded that of all the studies so far that have been published in autism and the goodness of putting these kids on a gluten-free diet boils down to 6 studies. 3 of the 6 studies say that the gluten-free diet does nothing and therefore is useless. The other 3 studies say that the gluten-free diet is very useful and therefore the kids should go on a gluten-free diet. Conclusion, we don't know. The best way to do it is to increase the number of studies to see who is right, who is wrong. Like to say, this is garbage. If you put more garbage, we will find out what the heck is going on. The reality of the story is that if we accepted these conditions, all the conditions of humankind are not homogeneous conditions, but are final destination. And how you got there can be different paths. For example, with autism, it is possible that, a certain percentage, they have autism because of dysbiosis in the gut, other with a genetic mutation, other with oxidative stress, and so on and so forth. And let's say that 20%, they reach their final destination through the gluten sensitivity. Now, if you do the intervention, let's say the gluten-free diet, and you take 100 kids with the assumption that only those 20 that have gluten sensitivity will respond, and you put them on a gluten-free diet, only the 20 will respond. The conclusion is failure, because 80% did not respond, so the efficacy of the gluten-free diet is crap. We should not use it because it doesn't work. Now, take the same population, and before they put them on intervention, again, it'd be, the gluten-free diet or probiotic, if you think of dysbiosis, you start to see who is who, and say, oh, I know that these 20 kids, they have the gluten sensitivity, and put only those on a gluten-free diet. Now you have 100% efficacy, success. So let me tell you, as the poop doctor, how I see the future. Not us. This is not going to happen in our generation. The next generation of physicians will do the kind of business I personalize medicine this way. The patient comes in, first of all, they take the chip of their genome and put in the computer so that they know what kind of genome they have. While they do visit, they will collect stools. We'll go in the machine. By the end of the visit, half an hour, they will have the microbiome of these people. They match it in the computer and say, you have the microbiome that's living in peace with you. There is no dysbiosis. Despite that you have the genes to develop Alzheimer, you're going to be fine. Or if they find that there's been a modification of the microbiome that now put at risk this individual to develop the problem, or the problem is already in the making because the metabolites show so, they will be intervened so that this is not going to happen. That, in my humble opinion, is the future. Am I a visionary? Am I a dreamer? Absolutely. No question about that. But guess what? I don't know if you saw this amazing movie. Anybody saw Ratatouille? Anybody has kids did it. If you have no kids or you never seen this movie, you got to see it. There is a lot of wisdom there. One of the most hateful figure was this individual. There was Antonigo, a guy that insisted that a cook cannot just be anybody. You're born and you're, grave as a cook. Even though, imagine a rat to be a cook. But at the end, he had to change his mind. And the quote that I love to share with you is this: the world is often unkind with new talents, new creation, or new ideas. The new needs friends. Not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. If we all will have that kind of open mind, we will do the best service possible to the people that come to us to seek help. Because after all, if we decide to embrace this profession, it's because that's our mission. Thank you so much, guys.
Listening to the first of 2 lectures presented by Alessio Fasano, MD. In this last lecture, Dr. Fasano discussed the science behind the spectrum of gluten-related disorders, from celiac disease to gluten sensitivity, and its impact on other chronic diseases. Cell Science Systems has several assays relevant to this lecture series, the first being markers which determine genetic predisposition for celiac disease. This includes the HLA-DQ2 and DQ8 genes. Also available are various antibody markers, such as tissue transglutaminase, TTG, and deaminated gliadin peptide, DGP. As well, ASCA, anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody, found primarily in inflammatory bowel disease patients with Crohn's disease. Additionally, cellular analysis for gluten and other food sensitivities using the ALCAT methodology is available. These assays are available to providers in various single and multiple assay configurations. To inquire for additional literature or research, you can contact the lab at info@alcat.com.